What an awesome God we serve. Welcome to the Emmaus Group's first teaching video, and we really hope you find it interesting. Now, for a moment, let's go back and look again at verse 14, where God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years." It's important to understand that God created the lights in the heavens for a number of reasons. He put them there to help us keep track of the days and the years, and to give us what we know as our calendar. But he also put them there to act as signs, and he put them there to tell us when seasons would fall. Now, in Hebrew, the word used for season is moedim, which refers to God's appointed times. And these times are, in a sense, like appointments in God's diary, appointments the Most High has with his people. And you will understand the greater significance of these later in this presentation. What is important to keep in mind is that God has done this for us for a reason. It is a form of communication. However, there is a problem. As followers of Jesus Christ, we have been taught to avoid exploring and discussing the stars in heaven for fear of becoming entangled in astrology. Astrology is a satanic perversion, a perversion of biblical astronomy. Astrology teaches people that the position of the stars and their movements has an influence on their lives and personality. However, as God tells us, right at the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, he created the lights in the heavens to be for signs for us. Through fear of entanglement in astrology, Satan has actually done a good job of causing us to turn our eyes away from the very things that God always intended us to see, things which are now becoming very important. So what we're going to share with you is not astrology, but an understanding of the signs that God has put in the heavens according to biblical astronomy, which is something altogether very different. Thousands of years ago lived a prophet called Daniel, as in the Daniel of the Old Testament. Daniel was a wise man, a seer, or as we know, a prophet. He was an Israelite, exiled along with his people for 70 years to Babylon during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, Cyrus, and Darius. Daniel was a man of great wisdom and understanding who could interpret dreams. In chapter 9 of Daniel, in verses 22 and 23, we read that he was visited by the archangel Gabriel, who told him his prayers had been heard, and that he had found favour, that he was greatly loved by God, and that he was to be given skill and understanding. He had also been promoted by Nebuchadnezzar as chief over all the wise men, because, as it is written in Daniel chapter 5, he was found to have an excellent spirit, knowledge, understanding, the ability to interpret dreams, solve riddles, and explain enigmas. As a Hebrew appointed chief over all the wise men, he would undoubtedly have appointed other Hebrews who had been exiled with him. Therefore it is likely that at the time of Jesus' birth, these wise men, or their descendants, who would have carefully studied both scriptures and prophecies, would recognize the signs that God had placed in the heavens, and, significantly, how to interpret them. The Magi who set off across the desert from the east knew both scripture and prophecy, and having observed the signs in the heavens, duly set out for Jerusalem. So what did they know, and what did they see? To understand what they knew, we just have to read the same scriptures and prophecies they read about the birth of Jesus. However, we also need to have a basic understanding of biblical astronomy. which is what we're going to share with you in a moment. What we can't do is to take you back in time to see what they saw in the skies above them from Babylon. But what we can do is to show you by using a piece of software called Stellarium. This uses precise astronomical data combined with the laws of physics to accurately simulate the movements of all the lights, the stars, the planets and constellations that God placed in the heavens for us. This remarkable software enables you to see the skies from anywhere in the world at any time in history. What you see on the screen reflects exactly what you see in the skies and is used by astronomers all over the world. So if we know what to look for based on the prophecies, combined with a simple basic understanding of biblical astronomy, we might just find what they did. Now, God himself spoke about specific constellations in the Bible, for example in his conversations with Job, in which God rebuked Job by saying, "Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth the Mazzaroth in their season? Or can you guide the bear with all her children? Do you know the ordinances of heaven? Can you establish their rule on the earth?" The word Mazzaroth is the Hebrew word describing the 12 constellations associated with the 12 months of our calendar. Every month the sun moves from one constellation to the next in a yearly cycle. Now, most ancient cultures had a fairly consistent understanding of the constellations and their meanings. The Magi who rode off to Jerusalem to inquire where Jesus was born would also have been familiar with this knowledge. As the scientists in their day, they would also have been tracking the movements in the heavens and, knowing the scriptures, were in a sense able to join the dots. These 12 constellations, known by all ancient peoples, are what we know today as the signs of the zodiac. Sadly, God's purposes for these signs have been hijacked and become what we know and referred to earlier as astrology. So consequently, Christians avoid looking at things to do with the stars for fear of being caught up in astrology. But nonetheless, the fact remains that God created them, set their patterns, ordained their movements, and decreed their seasons for us. Now, there are 2 constellations in the Mazzaroth that you need to know about before we explore further what it was that the Magi might have seen. The first one is a group of stars that form the shape of a lion, and you might know of it as Leo. In Hebrew, it's called Ari. According to biblical astronomy, it represents the royal tribe of Judah. The constellation that comes after Ari is in the shape of a woman and is known as Virgo, the Virgin, or in Hebrew, Betula. There are many constellations in the heavens, groups of stars, if you like, that God himself created and designed and put together in specific patterns. There are also planets which move independently of this backdrop of constellations. These planets look like stars that wander about the sky, and in ancient times that is just what they were called, wandering stars. These distinct heavenly lights also had meanings, and their movements were meticulously recorded by the Magi and other wise men. So what might the Magi have seen? Well, one of the prophecies they would have been familiar with is the one about the virgin birth in Isaiah 7:14. And interestingly, this prophecy, which was spoken to the house of David of the tribe of Judah, refers to God giving a sign. Was this sign simply the birth of a child to a virgin, or was there something else? Remember that in the beginning God said that he created the lights in the heavens to be for signs. Isaiah wrote, "The Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call him Emmanuel. And significantly, Emmanuel means God with us, and we'll come back to this point shortly. So is there any chance that this sign was something that might have been seen in the heavens? We also know that one of the constellations of the Mazarot is of the woman, the Virgin or Betula. And the book of Matthew tells us that the wise men came from the east to worship the King of the Jews, whose birth they knew of because of what they had seen in the heavens, what we know as the so-called Star of Bethlehem. Using Stellarium to rewind the sky, it's possible today to see it. We know that it wasn't too obvious at the time, even though Christmas cards try to portray it as being some incredibly bright star. And the reason we know this is because Matthew himself states that Herod had to ask about it, because he and his so-called wise men hadn't seen it and didn't even know when it appeared. So we're going to use Stellarium to set the location to Baghdad, which is near enough Babylon, and we're going to rewind the skies all the way back to around 3 BC, which is around the time that historians generally agree Jesus was likely to have been born. Just before we look at the sky in detail, there are a couple of final things you need to know. There is one particularly bright star in the constellation of Ari called Regulus. And Regulus is known as the King's Star, and this, as you are about to see, is very significant. You also need to understand the meanings of certain wandering stars, which are actually planets. And these are all visible to the naked eye and would have been seen by the Magi. Now there are 5 of them, the largest of which is Jupiter. Jupiter is known as the king planet and is quite distinct from Regulus, the king's star. In Hebrew the name is Zedek, and Zedek also means righteousness. So in biblical astronomy, Jupiter represents a righteous king. The second largest is Saturn, and in ancient civilizations and occultic religions, the planet Saturn was always associated, directly or indirectly, and through different names, with Satan. The brightest is Venus, and is often referred to as the bright morning star. It represents the true Messiah, and Jesus himself tells us, in Revelation 22, that he is the root and offspring of David, the bright morning star. And finally, the 2 other wandering stars you need to know about are Mercury and Mars, both representing messengers or archangels. So now you have all the information you need to look for the same signs the Magi saw. Let's use Stellarium to rewind the sky back to 3 BC.
To show you what the Magi saw, we've set the location as if you were standing in Babylon next to the wise men. The year is 3 BC, even though the software in the bottom right hand corner shows it as being -2. This is because our calendar doesn't have a year 0 between BC and AD. As you can see, the date is the 1st of August and the sun is in the constellation of Ari. Now, we're going to animate the skies for you and move forward in time from the 1st of August to mid-September. As we do, you'll notice Jupiter and Venus moving towards Regulus. To help you follow Venus, we've put red markers on it. As you can see, Venus moves much faster, but if you watch carefully, on the 11th of August, Venus and Jupiter join, and they form what appears to be a very bright double star, a combination of planets representing the Messiah and the righteous King. Apart from the moon, this would have been the brightest object in the night sky, and it occurs exactly 1 month before something else significant. Keep in mind that Jupiter represents a king, and Venus the Messiah. What do you think God might have been saying? Venus then continues ahead of Jupiter, and 5 days later joins with Regulus, the king star, creating another combination of a king star with a planet representing a Messiah, king and Messiah. Such individual combinations do happen on a fairly regular basis. However, what's remarkable in the time frame that we're showing you is the collection and sequence of these events all coming together. Moving forward into early September, we can see how the Sun has moved from Leo into Virgo, who signifies a virgin. It's closely pursued by Venus, the Messiah, and Mercury, the Archangel, who've joined and travelled together for a while. Then, Mercury, the Archangel, goes ahead of Venus, the Messiah, and on the 11th of September, exactly 1 month after the coming together of the planets representing the Messiah and the righteous King, Venus arrives in the constellation of Virgo. What's fascinating about this date is that it's the Feast of Trumpets, one of the Moedim, God's appointed times. What's also amazing is that on the very same day as the Messiah planet enters the constellation of Virgo, the Virgin, the king planet, Jupiter, joins with the king star, Regulus, in the royal constellation of Ari, which is associated with the tribe of Judah. You can see this in the constellation of Leo on the screen. If all this was a message, then what was God saying? Well, let's keep looking. The prophecy in Isaiah says that the Son will be born of the Virgin and will be called Emmanuel, meaning God with us. And this phrase, God with us, is associated with one of the Moedim, which always begins 15 days after the Feast of Trumpets. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, a feast during which God's people celebrate God dwelling with man. So, let's look at what happened during the Feast of Tabernacles in 3 BC. That year it began on the 26th of September, and on the third day of the feast, the 29th, something interesting happened. When you look at the overlaid artwork for the constellation of Virgo, you should note it doesn't align properly with the actual pattern of the stars. This is a software issue. However, can you see the bright star below the artwork with the label Spicer? If you look above it, you'll see a star next to the V of the label Virgo. These two stars represent the women's hips. On the third day of the Feast of Tabernacles in 3 BC, the planet representing the Messiah passed between these two stars, through what was, in effect, the birth canal of the Virgin. Incredibly, the Messiah, who was to be called Emmanuel, meaning God with us, was actually born on the 29th of September, during the feast when God's people were celebrating God dwelling with man. But this amazing story, being played out in the heavens, didn't stop there.
For those of us who believe that Jesus was born on the 25th of December, at Christmas time, this new understanding may come as a bit of a surprise or even a shock. But among certain followers, especially those with an understanding of the Hebraic roots of the Christian faith, this has been known for some time. They understand this because they understand the significance of the Lord's feasts, the Moedim. What is also important to understand is that the wise men were not present shortly after the birth, as is so often portrayed in the Christmas story. In fact, they didn't arrive in Bethlehem until Jesus was about 9 months old. Matthew's account reflects this, in that he wrote, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod, behold, wise men came from the east, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" Note Matthew says, after Jesus was born. If you read on to verse 11, it's written that they saw the young child with his mother. And this also accounts for why Herod later ordered the killing of all young boys under 2 years of age. Read Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 16 if you're not sure. And the Star of Bethlehem, which you're also going to see in a few moments, didn't appear until June 2 BC, about 9 months after the birth in September 3 BC. And this correlates with the scriptures telling us that the wise men saw him as a young child. So let's watch the heavens and see what happens between the Feast of Trumpets through to June the following year.
Occasionally, planets appear to do something rather odd. They look as though they stop, move backwards and then forwards again, or even do a loop. They don't actually do this, it's just an illusion created by their different orbits around the Sun, and is known as retrograde motion. Earlier in the presentation, before the birth, we pointed out to you a meeting of the heavenly kings, Regulus and Jupiter. Now we want to show you another remarkable sequence of events. After that meeting on the Feast of Trumpets, Jupiter moved forwards, but then stopped. We've put red markers on it to help you, so watch carefully and see what happened. You can see how Jupiter appeared to stop. Now it goes back to meet with Regulus a second time. And then it keeps going backwards and stops and turns, returning for a third meeting on the 5th of April. So 3 times in 7 months, the king planet met with the king star in the royal constellation of Ari. This must have been the confirmation they needed, having seen the birth portrayed in the heavens the previous September, that the prophesied Messiah, the King of Kings, promised to the tribe of Judah, had indeed been born. Now it takes about 5 to 6 weeks to ride by camel from what was Babylon to Jerusalem, and they went there because Jerusalem was the capital of Judah, the assumption being that such a king must have been born in the capital, hence they asked Herod where Jesus was. Amazingly, when they arrived in Jerusalem, the bright double star they'd seen at the beginning of this whole story, created by the Messiah planet meeting with the King planet, appeared again. If we fast forward a little more, you can see Venus catch up with Jupiter and create the bright double star. That was the Star of Bethlehem. This final sign, in what was an incredible sequence, led them to Bethlehem, of which it is written, "But you, Bethlehem, even though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler of Israel."
Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God, and 2,000 years ago he used them to show us something historic was about to happen. The birth of his son to a virgin during the Feast of Tabernacles. As the lights in heaven portrayed a birth, so it actually happened here on earth. That day the Father's will was indeed done on earth as it is in heaven. However, Jesus' birth was not the only time heavenly signs had been written about. In Revelation 12, verses 1 to 4, the Bible again speaks of signs, but this time indicating something very different. They warn us of the time that Jesus spoke of, when he said, "Then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be." So after all you've seen so far, we hope you're beginning to appreciate that when God says he will put signs in the heavens to tell us something, he does. Both Jewish and Gentile believers will suffer greatly in this final period of human history, which we know from the scriptures to be 3.5 years, the Great Tribulation. So now we want to show you what we found.
By now, you'll be familiar with the woman in the heavens, Betula, which played a part in the signs depicting Jesus' birth. Revelation 12 also speaks of a woman clothed in the sun and with the moon under her feet. If you think back to what we showed you in 3 BC, you might already be thinking this sounds a bit familiar. But in case you haven't made the connection, we'll show you. This is what you saw earlier from 3 BC. Betula is clothed with the sun, as you can see, with the moon under her feet. Revelation says, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." Although the sign in 3 BC depicted a woman giving birth, there was no crown of 12 stars above her head. The sign in Revelation 12 occurs just before the time when Satan is cast down to the earth. He then makes war with the saints for 3.5 years, a time known as the Great Tribulation. However, by using Stellarium to fast forward in time, we discovered something really interesting. You can see the woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, but this time there is something fascinating going on above her head. A crown is a symbol of royalty. The constellation of Ari, which is above the woman's head, represents the royal tribe of Judah and is made of 9 stars, which you can see are all connected by the faint blue lines on the screen. What's interesting on this particular date, however, is that 3 wandering stars have now joined them and line up above her head, making a crown of 12 stars. The date this appears is the 23rd of September 2017, the Feast of Trumpets. But what about the rest of Revelation 12? Well, it goes on to say, "And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child he might devour it." Later, in chapter 12, we are told who this great dragon is. He's the ancient serpent of old, Satan. There are several constellations representing serpents or dragons, but 3 of them in particular appear to form one great serpent, winding its way around the other constellations in the sky. As the serpent winds around the sky, it weaves around 10 constellations. Could these represent the 10 horns? Finally, the tail of the serpent is a constellation called Hydra, a very large constellation with a transit time of 8 hours. Because of the Earth's rotation, the stars appear to move across the sky, rising in the east and setting in the west. It takes 24 hours for them to complete a cycle, and so 1/3 of a cycle, 8 hours, actually equates to covering 1/3 of the sky. The tail of the serpent sweeps out 1/3 of the sky. In this picture, if you look carefully, you can see its head is near the feet of the woman, waiting to devour what she gives birth to. You can also see, just above it, the constellation of Hercules. This constellation depicts the head of the Hydra, a 7-headed serpent. At the head of the serpent is a constellation Corona Borealis, which is a crown, consisting of 7 stars. If all this wasn't enough, see what else we've discovered in the following animation that runs from the 23rd of September 2017 through to early 2018.
For this next video, we want you to watch Mercury, and to help you we've put red markers on it as we did before with Venus. So let's watch what happens as Mercury moves across the sky towards Saturn. As it approaches Saturn, it begins to slow down and goes into retrograde. Saturn then moves away towards the constellation of Sagittarius, which is, as we mentioned before, associated with the Antichrist. However, Mercury comes back for a second strike and passes Saturn on the 13th of January in 2018. It then continues to move away, leaving Saturn behind, still in the constellation of Sagittarius. And what is notable about this is that Saturn, representing Satan, remains in the constellation of Sagittarius, who is associated with the Antichrist, for 3 years. Stellarium has demonstrated that signs appearing to depict those in Revelation 12 will begin on the Feast of Trumpets in 2017. Before making the decision to produce this video, we spent 5 months testing these discoveries with over 60 church and ministry leaders. And we're very aware of the gravity of this message, and to be really clear, we are not date fixing Jesus' return, because no one knows the hour or the day but the Father. And neither are we telling you that certain things will happen on certain dates, because we just don't know. All we are doing is sharing what we have discovered and tested. So what does this all mean? Very simply, we believe we have but a short time before the world becomes much darker and life becomes much more difficult for disciples of Jesus Christ. Our news media is already full of indicators that the tribulation has in fact begun building momentum, with Christians being persecuted and martyred in many countries, especially in the Middle East. But we can and must also rejoice, for our salvation is drawing near, as these global events indicate and indeed vindicate the truth of God's word. Our advice is to pray and ask God to speak to you personally about what you've seen in this video. We also suggest that now may be the time to begin repenting and truly seeking first the kingdom of heaven and God's righteousness. That you use the days ahead wisely to prepare yourselves for this time of great trouble. Because God himself said in Revelation 21, whoever overcomes shall inherit all things. That a time is coming when God will dwell again with his people. God himself will be with them, and they shall be his people. He will wipe away every tear. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things will have passed away.